She didn't know what to do or what to say to the people that kept asking her why it was that she didn't have kids, why it was that she couldn't get pregnant. Hannah decided to take matters into her own hands one day, and she went to the temple. She went to the temple to pray. As she was there, something interesting happened. As she was praying, she took some of the sand and she started rubbing it on her stomach. And she kept praying out loud, and the priest saw her and thought that she was extremely crazy because of what she was doing. Hadn't really seen this before, and this was not something that was ordinary. So Eli came out of the place of meeting and said, "Hey, you're drunk. You need to go away. You can't be here because of how you are." Hannah was stunned with this and just looked at him and stayed silent. And that made Eli kind of question about what was going on. Hannah explained to him what happened and what she was doing, and Eli was taken back as well. All that was going through his mind is, oh, did I really just push away someone that really needs God a lot right now? So he looked at her and said, "No, I have confidence that God is going to answer your prayer." So Hannah got up and she smiled. She went back home. As she went back home, you can only imagine what was going through her head and the thoughts that she had during this time. Probably one of, well, is God really going to answer my prayer? Am I going to see what the priest actually told me would happen? What am I going to do if it does happen? Probably a lot more questions that we don't even think about. Got home and time went as normal. Her time with family and friends and everything else. 9 months later, a little boy came. And when he came, she named him Samuel. And even before that, she told God that if he gave her her firstborn son, he would dedicate she would dedicate this young man to the work that God had planned, giving him back to the sanctuary so that he would work for God forever. Now, not just in that time, but even in this time, making that promise of saying, I'm going to do something, I'm going to stick to something, that's not the easiest thing to do, is it? But it is worth it in the end, and even while we're doing it. Hannah knew her promise. She knew what she told God. She knew that she had to go through with it. So at the right time, when he was at the right age, young age, just a couple years old, she took him back to the sanctuary to the priest Eli and gave him to God as promised so that he would work for God there in the sanctuary, doing amazing things that we could only imagine of what he might have been doing. As she dropped him off that day, she told him that while they would be able to come and visit from time to time, this is where God needed him to be. There was a special work that he was going to be doing that God had called him to. That as time developed, God would show him and he would more fully understand. Now, for someone that young, having your parents drop you off somewhere and not really understanding what's going on is very confusing. Even being at certain ages, having someone drop you off and not knowing what you're supposed to do is very confusing as well. But he took Eli's hand and they went inside, and Eli started to share with him what Samuel would be doing and how things would be as time progressed. Now, in those instructions, Samuel couldn't even start to believe or start to think about what God was actually calling him to do, or even why he was there in the sanctuary. But he trusted with what his mom said and what Eli and what others had said, and he's had the attitude, which is an attitude we should have right now as well, that whatever God asks me to do, I'm going to do it. Not only am I going to do it with all my might, all my strength, I'm going to have a positive attitude while I do this so that when others see me, others see what's going on, they are going to see God Himself and see God working through me with everything that I'm doing, everything that I'm saying, and everything that's going on. Time went on and Samuel continued to grow till one day, as they were wrapping up and getting ready for bed, everyone went to their own little quarters, and Samuel went to his and laid down in bed and went to sleep, and he heard his name. When he heard his name, he thought that there was something wrong, and so he jumped up and ran to Eli and asked very anxiously as far as what he needed, because he was used to that there was times at night where he might be called because something that was needed, and he needed to be ready at a moment's notice. Eli was still asleep and turned over and said, I didn't call you. Just go back to bed. So Samuel, going back to bed, scratching his head, not sure what to do, went to his bed and fell back asleep. Then a few minutes later, he hears his name being called again. Jumps up and, well, maybe it actually was, and he remembered this time. He runs to Eli, and Eli looks at him and goes, no, I didn't call you, just go back to bed. By this time, getting kind of frustrated with, well, Samuel's probably playing a game, and I'm not going to be a part of it. Samuel goes back to bed, very confused now. Lays down, and a couple minutes later again, his name is called. He slowly gets out of bed and walks down, wakes Eli again, and says, come on, you did call me. What's going on? Eli looks at him and says, I think we've got something different going on. I think that it's God that actually called you. Samuel was really confused because why would God call him? And Eli, with tears in his eyes, looks at him and says, here's what you need to do next time you hear the voice. Say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Samuel says yes and turns around to start walking back to his room, extremely confused with, what's going on? Why would God call me? If it is God, what does he have to tell me? Samuel gets back to his room and lays down and closes his eyes and starts to drift off to sleep, and then he hears his name being called again. He sits up in bed slowly and remembers what Eli told him to say, and he says, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. As he says that, God starts talking to him and starts explaining to him what's going on, not just with the nation of Israel, but also with Eli and his family and everything that had been going on in the sanctuary. And even with that, God started telling Samuel what his plans for him in the future were and how he was called to be a prophet to the people around him. And this is why he was there and what he was training for at that moment in time. Samuel didn't even know what to think about that because It was so overwhelming with everything that was going on. But at the same time, he'd been told from a very young age, and was told even then, when God finally shares with you and shows you what you're going to be doing, be ready. It's going to be one of the most amazing journeys of a lifetime if you're willing to trust what God has planned. Not easy then, not easy now, but it is good because it's learning to follow God even in the hardest of times so that we're able to do what needs to be done. Everything was spinning in Samuel's mind as God finished telling him all this stuff. The point where it took him a while to get back to sleep. That next morning, when Samuel finally got up, his head was still spinning. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to take all this stuff, and all that he knew that he could do was to get up and start his day, start his normal chores. But still, that didn't seem to help. Even going through all these routines just caused more confusion in his mind than anything else. But he knew what God had asked him to do and how he asked him to live, so he just kept in that cycle. Eli came to him and asked him what God told him because he was sure that God gave him something very important in a prophecy specifically for Eli and his family. Samuel was very hesitant, very unsure about even saying anything to Eli. But Eli kept pressing because he knew that God told Samuel something important. So Samuel, with tears going down his cheeks, looked at Eli and started sharing what was going on and what was going to happen and the ultimate end of Eli and his family. Eli heard it and he started crying too because he knew that Samuel had been given a message from God. And he knew that the only thing that he could say is, whatever it is that God wants, that's what's going to happen. Even though he said that, he didn't really want to believe it, but he knew that what Samuel said was going to happen. Samuel didn't know what was going to happen next. He didn't know how things were going to unfold, but he knew this, and this is something that we can learn from as well. When God gives a promise, he's going to see it through. He's going to help us through, and he's going to guide our paths. Samuel continued to trust God through the ups, through the downs, through everything that was going on. And he continued to do what God asked him to do. He became an amazing prophet to all those that were around him. And God used him in ways that we cannot even start to imagine because of the fact that Samuel trusted in God. Yes, he had his problems too. Everyone does. But he kept trusting God no matter what the outcome may be. Now, that's the lesson for us right now. Even though we have our problems, even though we've got situations and tests and book reports and all this other stuff, we can trust God because He has promised an amazing future. He has promised us an amazing today. All we need to do is to remember and say, I will trust Him. I will listen. I will go and do whatever God asks me to do.